The kid pointed his phone at the old man and grinned. "Watch this, fellas." The old man in the plaid jacket didn't look up. He was sitting by the window in coach class, a paper cup of tea going cold on the tray table in front of him, his weathered hands folded in his lap. He hadn't said a word since boarding in Ottawa, hadn't asked for anything, hadn't complained about the 3 young men across the aisle who had been loud since Brockville. Caden Ritchie, 24 years old, fresh out of a marketing internship, decided the old man was the funniest thing he'd seen all week. He stretched his legs across the aisle and planted his sneakers firmly on the armrest of the seat, directly beside the old man. Right there, 6 inches from the man's elbow, sole of the shoe angled toward the old man's face. His 2 friends burst out laughing. Someone further down the car turned to look, then looked away. "Human Gramps?" Caden said, still filming. "Little crowded for your taste?" The old man turned his head slowly and looked at the sneakers on the armrest. Then he looked at Caden. His expression didn't change. His eyes were the pale grey of old lake ice, and they were very calm and they held no anger. He turned back to the window. "Didn't think so," Caden said, and his friends laughed again. If you think that young man deserved what was coming, type respect in the comments. He had no idea what he was sitting next to. None of them did. His name was Dennis Forsythe, 76 years old, white-haired, with a face that had been weathered into something past handsome, carved down to the essential like driftwood. He was wearing a plaid flannel jacket he'd owned for 15 years. The kind with the corduroy collar that his daughter kept threatening to throw away, and he kept quietly rescuing from the donation box. Under it, a plain dark turtleneck. In his breast pocket, a small paperback of poetry he'd been reading for the 3rd time. He was travelling from Ottawa to Toronto because his granddaughter Claire was playing in her first competitive hockey tournament, and she'd called him 2 weeks ago and said, "Papa, will you come?" And there wasn't a power on earth that could have kept him away. He hadn't booked business class. It hadn't crossed his mind. He'd left the apartment at 6 in the morning, walked 3 blocks to Union Station in the November cold, bought a cup of tea from Tim Hortons the way he always did when he passed through Ottawa, and found his seat. He had a window. That was enough. He liked watching the Ontario countryside slide past. The flat farmland going grey and brown in November, the bare maples, the old barns that reminded him of the farm his grandfather had kept outside of Truro, Nova Scotia, when Dennis was a boy. There was a small pin on the lapel of his jacket, a pale blue circle with a white map of Cyprus at the centre, the kind of pin you'd have to know to recognise. Most people, when they noticed it at all, assumed it was from a charity. It wasn't from a charity. Dennis had stopped explaining what it was years ago. The explanations tended to go long, and he'd never liked going long. The young men across the aisle had been loud since Brockville. Caden, the one doing most of the talking, was the kind of loud that required an audience, which meant he needed the 2 friends on either side of him to keep laughing and nodding, and they obliged. Dennis had listened to 40 minutes of it with the patience of a man who had waited out things considerably worse than noise. When Caden put his feet on the armrest, Dennis looked at the sneakers. He looked at the young man's face. He turned back to the window. His hands, folded in his lap, were steady. That was the part people who knew him would have recognized. In 4 decades of service, Dennis Forsythe's hands had always been steady. In the desert, in the dark, in the places that didn't make the news. Steady hands were not something he'd been born with. They were something he'd learned, in the same slow, painful way you learn everything that matters. He thought of Claire and her hockey stick and looked out the window and let the fields go by. 30 minutes outside of Toronto, the quiet car door slid open. The man who came through was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a grey wool blazer, but he carried himself the way only certain men carry themselves, with the compressed, deliberate economy of someone who had spent a very long time in command. He was perhaps 60 silver at the temples, and he moved through the car with the unhurried attentiveness of someone taking in every detail of a room without appearing to look at anything in particular. He was heading toward the washrooms at the far end of the car. He passed Caden and his friends without slowing. He passed the woman with the sleeping infant. He passed 2 university students with textbooks open. And then he reached the row where Dennis Forsythe was sitting, and he slowed. He'd seen the pin. He stopped, stood in the aisle and looked more carefully. The small pale blue circle, the white map of Cyprus. His expression shifted into something careful and still. Then he saw the second pin, smaller, half hidden beneath the lapel's fold. A bronze maple leaf, the Canadian Forces decoration, 30 years of service minimum. He leaned in slightly, the way a man does when he's not certain he's seeing what he thinks he's seeing. Dennis turned from the window. The two men looked at each other for a moment. "Excuse me," the man said quietly. "Is your name Forsythe, Dennis Forsythe?" The quiet car had been paying loose attention since Caden's performance. Now it went tighter. Even Caden looked up from his phone. Dennis regarded the man for a moment. Something moved in his pale grey eyes. Not quite recognition, but the edge of it, the shape of something familiar. "It is," Dennis said. His voice was low, and even the kind of voice you had to be quiet yourself to hear properly. The man in the grey blazer was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened his shoulders, and in the aisle of a Via Rail coach car, he came to attention. "Sir," he said, "Brigadier-General Alan Corrigan, retired. 2 PPCLI. He paused, and his voice had changed, tightened with something that was not quite composure. "You trained me, Ottawa, 1994. You changed the way I understood what this work was for." Dennis looked at him for a long moment. A quiet recognition settled into his face. "Corrigan," he said, "I remember." Corrigan held himself still. "Sir, with respect, why are you in coach?" Dennis gave a small shrug. "It's a fine seat." Corrigan shook his head. He turned. The quiet car was watching him now. All of it, even the university students, even the woman with the infant who had woken up. Caden had set his phone face down on his knee. "Forgive me," Corrigan said to the car, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that carries without effort. "I'd like to take a moment, if I may." Nobody told him no. "The man sitting here," Corrigan said, "is Lieutenant-Colonel Dennis Forsythe, retired, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry." A pause. "In September of 1993, in a place in Croatia called the Medak Pocket, Lieutenant-Colonel Forsythe commanded a company that stood between Croatian forces and a cluster of villages they intended to reach. His men were outgunned and operating under peacekeeping rules of engagement that made every single decision a legal and moral calculation in real time, under fire, in the dark. They held that line for 36 hours. His voice was steady, but just barely. He personally led the extraction of civilians, women, children, 2 elderly men, across open contested ground. He went back more than once. He was recommended for the Medal of Military Valor. He paused. He declined the individual commendation. The car was absolutely silent. Caden Ritchie's feet were no longer on the armrest. "He declined," Corrigan continued, "because, and I am quoting from the file, because I have read it more times than I can count," he said. "The action was collective. The recognition should be collective. He returned to Canada, trained officers at CFB Petawawa for the better part of a decade, and retired quietly. He never wrote a memoir. He has never given an interview. I know this because I once tried to arrange a ceremony in his honor, and he called me personally to ask me not to." A faint note of something entered his voice, affection and the weight of genuine debt. "He told me the men who didn't come home were the ones who deserved the ceremony." Dennis had been looking at the tray table in front of him while Corrigan spoke. Now he looked up. "Alan," he said quietly, "that's enough." "No, sir," Corrigan said. "With respect, it isn't." Caden Ritchie was gripping his phone in both hands, not looking at it. He had grown up in a suburb of Ottawa, with a view of the Gatineau Hills from his bedroom window, had gone to a good school, had never once had to wonder whether the country he lived in was worth defending. That was not his fault. It was simply the fact of his life, the way a warm house in February is simply a fact, until the heat goes out and you understand suddenly what warmth costs. He was beginning to understand something. It was not a comfortable understanding. "Sir," Corrigan said, turning to Dennis, "I have a seat in business class. I would be honoured, genuinely honoured, if you'd take it." Dennis looked at him. "Alan, you don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to," Corrigan said. "I want to. There's a difference. You taught me that difference." His voice had gone quiet enough that it wasn't performing anymore. It was just true. "You taught me that and about 20 other things I use every single day. Please." Dennis was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the November landscape, the grey sky, the bare fields, a small frozen pond catching the pale light at the edge of a tree line. He looked at Caden and his friends. He looked at each of them in turn, briefly and without heat. He reached for his paper cup of tea, found it long cold, set it back down. "All right," he said, "but I want a word first." Corrigan stepped back. Dennis turned to face the three young men. He didn't raise his voice. He never had needed to. "Son," he said to Caden, "how old are you?" Caden cleared his throat. 24, sir." Dennis nodded slowly. "I was 21 when I shipped out the first time. Cyprus. Do you know where Cyprus is?" "An island," Caden said. "Mediterranean." "That's right." Dennis looked at him with those pale grey eyes that held no anger, only something older and more patient than anger. "I was 21. I'd never been anywhere except Nova Scotia and basic training. And all of a sudden I was standing between two groups of men who wanted to kill each other, and the only thing keeping them from doing it was us. A few dozen Canadians from places like Truro and Red Deer and Trois-Rivières standing in the middle of it. Not because we chose the posting, because that's what we were for." He paused. "That's what service is for, not for making yourself important, not for making yourself look a certain way to the people watching, for standing in the place where no one else will stand, and taking the weight of it and not complaining about it, because the people beside you are carrying the same weight." He looked at the phone, still face down on Caden's knee. "I don't know what you were trying to do earlier. I imagine it seemed funny. I've seen that look before, the look that wants a reaction, that wants someone to flinch so the person doing it can feel large." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand it. Young men feel smaller than they let on. I did too, at 21. But I'll tell you what I told every officer I ever trained. The measure of a man isn't how much space he takes up. It's what he's willing to carry so that others don't have to." Caden's jaw was tight. One of his friends had looked away toward the window. The other had his hands pressed flat on his thighs, like a man trying to keep them still. "I'm not angry with you," Dennis said. "I don't have the energy for it, and it wouldn't do either of us any good. But I want you to remember something. Not for my sake, for yours." He held Caden's gaze with a steadiness that was not unkind. "Every person you pass on a train, in a coffee shop, waiting on a corner for the light to change, they are carrying something you cannot see. Some of them are carrying things that would stop you cold if you knew the weight of it. The least you owe them is the small dignity of being left in peace." He looked briefly at the other two young men as well. "That applies to all three of you. It isn't complicated, it just takes practice. A beat of silence, that's all." He reached for his small paperback and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He picked up his paper cup, looked at it for a moment, then set it down. "Caden," he said. The young man looked up sharply, startled at hearing his own name in that voice. "You look like you have some good in you. Don't waste it." Caden blinked hard once. "Yes, sir," he said. His voice had gone to almost nothing. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Dennis nodded once. The matter was settled as far as he was concerned. Corrigan carried his bag, the way you carry something for a person when no other gesture feels adequate. They moved toward the front of the train together, and as they passed through the coach car, a few people looked up. An older man in a canvas jacket, 2 rows ahead, had been listening carefully. He didn't say anything, but when Dennis passed, he gave a small nod. The particular nod that men of a certain generation exchange when they recognize something in each other that needs no explanation. Dennis returned it. In the connecting car, a middle-aged woman reached out and touched his arm as he passed. "Thank you," she said simply, "for your service." Dennis paused. He looked at her, directly and without hurry. "Thank you for saying so," he said, and meant it entirely, and moved on. Business class was quiet and warm. Corrigan's window seat looked out over the same November farmland, the same bare maples, the same flat fields running toward the horizon. Dennis settled into it slowly, his joints protesting the way they always did in the cold months, and looked out at the countryside moving past. Corrigan stood in the aisle a moment longer. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "You can ask," Dennis said. "Do you ever regret it, staying quiet about all of it?" Dennis considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Outside, a small lake slid into view, grey and still, bordered by brown reeds and a thin crust of early ice at the edges. "No," he said. "What happened in Croatia happened the way it needed to happen. The men who were there know what they did. That's sufficient." He was quiet for a moment. "Recognition is a fine thing, but it isn't what the work was for. If you do it for the recognition, you're doing it wrong." He looked out at the lake. I had a sergeant under me, Pierre Beclair from Chicoutimi, the best man I ever served with, and I've served with a great many good men. He carried a wounded private 300 meters through contested ground on a night I would rather not describe in detail. He never told anyone. I only know because I was there. He shook his head slightly. Pierre Beclair deserves every ceremony I was ever offered. So do the others. I'm just one man who did what was in front of him. Corrigan was quiet for a long moment. I'll call Beclair, he said finally. I should have called him years ago. Dennis looked up at him. Something softened in his pale grey eyes. He'd like that? Corrigan nodded. He hesitated, then offered his hand. Dennis shook it. It was good to see you, Alan, Dennis said. Yes, sir. Corrigan paused. How is she, Claire? Your granddaughter? Dennis's face did something it rarely did. It opened, fully and without reserve. She scored twice in practice last week, he said. Her coach says she's the fastest on the team. Corrigan smiled. The first time he'd smiled since he'd walked into that coach car. She comes by it honestly. Don't let her hear you say that, Dennis said. She'll never let me live it down. Corrigan laughed quietly and left him to his window. The train pulled into Union Station just past noon. Dennis took his time getting his bag down from the overhead rack. He was in no hurry, he never was. As he made his way off the train and up through the platform toward the main hall, he saw her before she saw him. Claire, 14 years old, red hair under a blue toque, wearing her team jacket with the Scarborough Sharks crest on the chest, standing on her toes, trying to see over the heads of the crowd. She'd come straight from morning practice. Her hair was still damp at the edges. When she spotted him, she waved, both arms, the way she'd been waving at him since she was 4 years old, like he was the most important thing she could see from wherever she was standing. He raised his hand in return, slowly the way he always did, the gesture that had always meant, I see you, I'm here, no need to worry. She met him halfway through the crowd and wrapped her arms around him, and he held her for a moment, his hand on the back of her head, her team jacket smelling of cold air and ice chips. How was the train? She asked, pulling back to look at him. Fine, he said, comfortable. She studied his face the way young people study old faces when they're trying to read something they're not sure is there. You look tired, Papa. I'm not tired, he said. I'm just old. There's a difference. She took his bag from him. He let her because she would have argued if he hadn't, and tucked her free hand into the crook of his arm as they walked toward the exit. Tournament starts at 2, she said. We have time to go to the arena, and I can show you where to sit so you can actually see the ice. I can always see. Last time you were behind the pillar, I could still see. Papa. He let her steer him. He didn't mind being steered by her. Union Station was busy, the Friday afternoon crowd filling the great hall with its vaulted ceiling and its particular echo that turned every footstep into something larger. Dennis walked through it at his pace, unhurried, taking in the room with the same steady attentiveness he'd brought to every room for 50 years, a habit too old now to set down. Near the east exit, they passed a young man standing on his own, looking at something on his phone, shoulders curved slightly inward against the noise of the hall. Something about the posture made Dennis slow his step. The young man looked up. It wasn't Caden Ritchie. It was a stranger with no connection to the train, going about his own Friday afternoon. But Dennis paused for a moment anyway, and looked at him, and the young man looked back, uncertain. Papa, Claire said. Nothing, Dennis said. He kept walking. She glanced back at the young man, then at her grandfather. What was that? Just a thought, he said. Never mind. They pushed through the doors into the November afternoon, the cold coming off the lake, sharp and clean, the way Toronto cold always arrived in November, like a reminder of something you'd been meaning to get to. Claire tucked herself closer to his arm against the wind. What was the thought, she asked. She was persistent the way he'd been persistent, which he found equal parts gratifying and inconvenient. Dennis considered it while they walked. The thought had been about Caden Ritchie, sitting somewhere now on a platform, or in a transit car, or in some warm office, carrying forward whatever he was going to carry forward from this afternoon. The thought had been about whether anything said on a train ever actually matters in the long run, and his conclusion was that sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, and you can't always know which, and you do it anyway. You show up, you say the true thing, you leave the rest to them. I met a few young men on the train, he said. They reminded me of something. Good or bad? Both, he said at the same time, which is usually how the important things work. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder as they walked. Are you going to tell me about it? Later, he said, after the game. He looked at her, that rare full opening in his face. Show me the arena. And she did. And he sat where she'd placed him, right beside the glass, with a clear line of sight, not behind any pillar, and he watched her skate out onto the ice with her teammates, a flash of red hair under a blue helmet, moving fast and clean and certain across the surface. The way his family had moved through difficult things for 3 generations, not hesitating, not looking back, trusting that the ground would hold. He pressed his gloved hands together in his lap and watched her go. He was to anyone in that rink who happened to glance his way, just an old man at a minor hockey tournament. A grandfather in a plaid jacket, white-haired, alone in his row, watching number 11 cut along the boards with his whole quiet face lit up, which was precisely what he had always wanted to be.